Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk from ITV Networks. Lovely to be with you. And today on the show, we're going to do things a little differently. Normally we have 3 interviews of about 24 minutes each. Today we are going to have the first interview running for an entire hour, and this is simply because Marcel van der Walt, our guest, who is a lecturer and a researcher at UNISA in police practice, or the Department of Police Practice, is here to unpack a whole host of very important issues. The one pertains directly to us as a Muslim community. Input is required from our community, and thus we're going to be talking long and hard about all of those issues. So we do hope you're going to keep us company for the first full hour with Marcel van der Walt. Thereafter, we'll be talking to Wiseman Hamilton, and he's going to be talking about the land grab issues. So serious stuff on the show. We do hope you're going to enjoy it, and we do hope we're going to give you food for thought. Marcel, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Julie, and to you and the listeners.
Lovely to have you once again. Lots to talk about, very important stuff, issues around social justice or injustice, whatever, whichever way you want to look at it. But first up, something really very, very important. You said to me off air, and I was really shocked about it, but we need to talk about it. You are talking about the ANC wanting to decriminalize the sex workers industry. So they want to decriminalize prostitution, but you've also told me that you noticed that there is no Muslim representation to obviously voice our objection to this. When and how did this process start?
Okay, well, this process started at least 2 decades ago already, and the South African Law Reform Commission was then charged with doing research and consulting with industry, with the public, on their views on the issue of so-called prostitution law. So within prostitution law, there are 4 different options. You have the current state of affairs is that prostitution is fully criminalized in South Africa. That means that both the buying and the selling of sex is criminalized, and it's been criminalized for a number of years already. And it's also been affirmed constitutionally just with the Jordan case, which is a case law that's been generated by the Constitutional Court. So basically the Law Reform Commission did their research, and that research report was published last year, where the Law Reform Commission considered it prudent that the current state of criminalization should remain, and then should there be a second option, that partial criminalization should be an alternative option. However, it's a vociferous debate, very complex, with a lobby groups pushing for the decriminalization of prostitution, largely from a rights-based perspective, the right to choose, the right to self-determination, and and I think it's a complex issue, and
So obviously you've been involved, or you've been at the hearings, and you've noticed that the Muslim community or Muslim representation has been absent at this particular hearing. How do we get representation on this particular board or the hearing?
Well, just to come back to that question, I think sadly, it's only those who really followed this debate over the last 20 years that's really been involved. You've got a couple of NGOs from the county human trafficking community, and then very strongly lobby groups, pleading basically for the full decriminalization of prostitution in South Africa. Few communities have been involved, but the Muslim community, as I mentioned off air, I haven't seen them. We've done presentations in Parliament where we've all made submissions as to why it should not or should be decriminalized. So there's still an opportunity to become involved with that. Yeah.
How does the Jamiat, or the body that represents the Muslim community of South Africa, how do they make contact with you, or whom do they make contact with to become involved and to voice their objection?
Sure. I mean, the whole project is out of the Law Reform Commission's hands now. So what happened on the 5th of March was the written submissions that were made. People had an opportunity to make oral submissions, and what the multi-party Women's Caucus of Parliament decided was that, well, you know what, it's clear that this issue needs to be deconstructed and ventilated more. So what they undertook to do is to engage with the public on a much larger scale to get inputs. So as soon as that process becomes known, then the details could be communicated to the Muslim community, and please do participate in that.
Well, what I will do is pass on your number to the Jamiyat and get someone to make contact with you and for them to understand how to get involved.
Sure.
From your perspective, and I know you've been in police service for over 10 years, you've been in this line of work for a very, very long time. Social justice is very close to your heart. How do you see this playing out? Let's assume prostitution is decriminalized. What do you see happening? How different is the landscape going to look?
I think currently in South Africa we are already struggling with the issues of violence against women and children. What I fully agree with was a finding through the Law Reform Commission's research that there will most probably be an immense cultural shift in how we view women, probably the increased commodification and women becoming more vulnerable because of a decision like that. I believe, working with human trafficking and organized crime for the last 16 years, I believe that victims of trafficking or even women being exploited will disappear in a legal market, you know. So there's certain powers that the police now have because it's a criminalized industry, which they no longer will be able to have. No longer will they be able to just go into a brothel, which is currently illegal, and search the premises and interview people on the premises. So there's a range of issues which will inevitably change and which requires further deconstruction.
I'm also thinking in terms of legalizing of prostitution or brothels, etc. There's not only prostitution taking place.
Exactly.
There's a lot of drug trafficking happening there as well, and a whole host of other social evils. Meaning that if prostitution does get legalized, all of those other issues will just kind of fall through the cracks, and perhaps we'll be sitting with an even bigger social evil than ever before.
I am absolutely, Julie, with my last 16 years currently still working in the field, doing investigations, visiting brothels as a researcher, or maybe doing undercover duties. That is what I see is going to be happening. And I think that there's a lot of arguments from the pro-decriminalization perspective that, well, do not conflate human trafficking and prostitution. Now, I do agree that there are women who voluntarily participate in sex work. However, it's a false dichotomy to say, well, you're either willingly doing it or you're unwillingly doing it. We are totally underestimating the one section in the human trafficking law which talks about the abuse of a position of vulnerability, where people can be vulnerable because of social circumstances, economic circumstances, being illegal in the country, being drugged, being addicted to drugs. Those are the particular issues which traffickers and pimps exploit, and where people find themselves in a position where they have no reasonable alternative but to submit to exploitation. And that is part of the definition which lobby groups for prostitution conveniently ignore. So once again, saying that there's so many things that still needs to be spoken about and
unconcealed.
Are you
suggesting with decriminalization there'll be further, I'm kind of wondering, they are at the end of their tether, they can't be further exploited, but perhaps there's just, I don't know, how's it going to tie them up further? I'm talking about the prostitutes. And that also, I'm thinking about, there was talks a while ago about decriminalizing the use of dagga, the sale and the use of dagga. But let's put that aside for a minute. Let's just still stick with prostitution.
Sure. So, I mean, those arguing that the current status of criminalization should remain have made significant submissions on exit programs. Let's put our money into providing viable exit programs for women, creating alternative options, because there's no way of ignoring the fact that, you know, the women and men engaged in this trade are facing a shrinking universe of choices in South Africa. So yes, people are desperate, but the argument remains that why can we rather not fight for the rights of women and children not to be in prostitution than their rights to opt for it?
Absolutely.
You know, so once again, it's a convoluted debate, and we need the public participation.
And a very dark and a murky world of sex, drugs, and
these
all
things are
evil.
intertwined. Organised
Absolutely.
crime, drugs,
Let's go for our first ad break. I'm talking to Marcel van der Walt. He's with UNISA. He's a researcher and a lecturer in the Department of Police Services at UNISA. He's been in the police services for over 10 years. Very passionate about the type of work he does. He's written a whole host of articles, and we're going to unpack all of that and much more. Please stay with us. Welcome back. I'm talking to Marcel van der Walt. We're talking issues around social justice. We do hope you're enjoying the program. Okay, we've covered the decriminalization of prostitution. We do hope and pray it doesn't get there. What about decriminalization of dagga, the use and the trade of dagga? Because you start with dagga and it then goes on to other harder, not that dagga is not a hard drug, but it goes on to other harder substances.
It's interesting because a lot of the principal arguments about rights and self-determination resonates with the whole issue of prostitution. But I do believe, I mean, working with the police, seeing how things escalate, I do believe dagga is a gateway drug to more harder substances. I'm not entirely sure where that debate is at the moment, but there's a lot of concern, especially people in the medical field as well, especially people from a law enforcement background, seeing what it does in our communities and how dagga usually elevates to other issues. Not even speaking about the medical side and psychosis and those kind of things. I'm not a medical practitioner, so I can't give you a
But
a
harder
medical
drugs
opinion.
and criminality.
Exactly,
obviously.
those usually go hand in hand, of course.
Okay, now in 2011 you worked on something called the case docket analysis.
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Yeah. Well, so that was a community engagement project with UNISA, where we received information from communities on human trafficking cases. So we did a case document analysis with the human trafficking cases, but also with the rape cases. I'm not entirely sure which one you're referring to, but the human trafficking case was receiving information from the community. We created a data analysis tool in which we were able to analyze trends and modus operandi of human traffickers, how they operate, how they move people, patterns in their modus operandi, basically. So
when we talk human trafficking here in South Africa, as I sit and talk with you, I can't even get my mind around the fact that it's happening right under our noses, because we lead very regular lives and we kind of think it's somebody else's problem north of our borders and possibly somewhere in the east in Asia. How rife is this practice in South Africa, and who are these victims? Where do they come from? Why do they find themselves in a situation like this?
Human trafficking is absolutely systemic in South Africa. You know, a common denominator on the part of victims is vulnerability or positions of vulnerability. And it's the vulnerability that really serves as the magnet for traffickers who then exploit that and who subjugate people. It's all about money, you know, it's about greed. It's driven by greed, power, control, and it's known as a high income and a low risk crime. And I think it's a low risk crime in South Africa because of wide scale social incentives in the country. You know, we live behind our walls. We see people begging in the streets around us every day. So we become numb. And by understanding what human trafficking is, we need to identify and define it correctly to really understand what it is, so that we can identify. And once you know what the questions are, you will look at a position of vulnerability in a very, very different light, and you may just find yourself asking different questions.
Okay, we know that when we talk human trafficking, we're not only talking women, we're talking children,
men,
and of course men as well. So what is human trafficking?
So we have we have probably got the most comprehensive and forward-thinking legislation in the world. I mean, our legislation became operational in August 2015. But basically, it's there's an action, there's a means, and there's a purpose. So the action could be recruitment, harboring. Those are the actions of getting people and then mobilizing them through deceit. It could be abduction, kidnapping, the abuse of a position of vulnerability. So it's really recruiting somebody, mobilizing a person, and then ultimately for the purpose of exploitation. And I think we are often fixated around the issue of sex trafficking or human trafficking for sexual exploitation, because that's what the Hollywood movies are made about. But people are trafficked for the purpose of organs and body parts, labor exploitation.
True? I've heard about it, and I kind of thought that sounds so far-fetched. Is that in fact happening?
Absolutely. The problem that we do have is that the boots on the ground, the people actually working with the cases, is really limited. So we need to get that funding. Government is still falling short in investing the funding that is really required to fully operationalize and make this act work. So what I'm saying is that the people working with these cases, the volume of investigators and prosecutors, the volume pales against the estimated scope of this issue in the country. So there are countless cases which are either not documented, or they're not reported, or they're not even identified. And once again, because we are so blinded through our social numbness, we fail to identify things literally happening around our nose. I'm not going to give you the Johannesburg suburb, which is not a big suburb, but 48 house-based brothels just in that one small suburb. And that
you should actually highlight it so people can avoid those areas.
Well, I mean, how do you avoid the area if you actually live and reside in the area? So, I mean, the point is for us as community members to practice active citizenry, and if you do see red flags, 120 cars visiting a specific house every week, you see minors in and out, you see surveillance. Well, I would prefer not mentioning the suburb, yet. It's part of a research study.
Okay,
so there's some ethical implications there. But the point is, it's, that could be a suburb anywhere else in South Africa.
Let's just go a couple of steps back and talk about the issue around the reasons for human trafficking. As you suggested, the common view is that it's for the sex trade, but you're also saying it's a very lucrative body part trade. I know that is a trade rife in the East, very particularly in India, and people then sell their kidneys and a whole host of other body parts because out of absolute dire poverty. What's happening, in our backyard? How does that work?
Okay, so one of the major trends, I'm working with 7 intelligence reports at this very moment, and what we are seeing that a lot of the harvesting is actually happening in Mozambique. So the market and the destination for the organs is actually South Africa. Many going to KZN, and this is all intelligence information. You're not going to find papers and research on this because it's such a subversive, underhanded crime. So is it happening? Absolutely. And a lot of the parts do go for muti purposes. We also know that West African syndicates, specifically Nigerian syndicates, use juju, and they are willing to pay significant amounts of money for whether it's for the perceivably medicinal value, or more to the more distorted size of of using it for criminal endeavors, witchcraft purposes, and there's an absolute market for it in South Africa. However, it has been identified that a lot of the harvesting happening outside South Africa, but also inside South Africa. So we are picking up, I mean, those murders that historically, before the legislation came out, has simply been labelled as Muti murder, could most probably, if we reinvestigate and repackage it within the current legislation, it could probably fit as a case of human trafficking for the purpose of organs and body parts. So,
absolutely sickening and frightening at the same time as well. So when you hear cases of missing children, missing people, I guess one of the reasons could be human trafficking for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I think we must always be very careful, you know, how we frame an incident without having the facts. And I think we often see this on social media, you know, where a person goes missing, or a child is missing, or a teenager is missing, and immediately people jump on the bandwagon, and there's a lot of scaremongering, or the person's probably been sold, or whatever the case may be. I think we should be very careful, and we should also not perpetuate it by liking or forwarding those kind of emails and communications on Facebook. So I just have to warn against that, you know. But I think, up until you don't have facts, it's very difficult to say what the situation could be, because I mean, you know, some of the recent statistics on missing persons in South Africa, which I've just completed a PhD study in human trafficking, and some of the statistics on missing persons is that from 2000 to 2015, in excess of 28,000 people missing.
Sure.
That's still missing.
Let's hold that thought. Let's go for another ad break. We'll be back to continue that thought. Marcel van der Walt is talking to us about the dark and murky world of human trafficking, drugs, prostitution, and everything else that goes with it. Do stay with us. Welcome back. We continue our discussion with Marcel van der Walt. He's from UNISA. We're talking human trafficking and a whole host more. You were giving us figures, Marcel, and I stopped you there for an ad break.
No problem. I think the problem with statistics in South Africa, first and foremost with human trafficking, we don't have any reliable statistics. So a lot of the cases still become subsumed under cases like domestic violence, kidnapping, assault.
And these are local people. We're not talking about people from beyond our borders. Are these actual South African citizens that have gone missing?
Okay, so when we come to the issue of missing persons, we're talking about South Africans. So I stand to be corrected, but I can say that between 2000 and 2015, in excess of 23,000 people, adults, still missing. So that's a 15-year period. Now, it might not sound that much. And in the same period, children, about 3,800, still missing. So there's a host of issues that needs to be deconstructed, because you know, many parents, believe it or not, Julie, don't even report their kids missing when they go missing, you know. So there's a lot of questions that needs to be asked. But where are these people? To simply say that they are trafficked is definitely not prudent. And I think what we do need is to re-look these cases. Now, with our current knowledge about human trafficking and how it manifests, a good exercise could be, could we not look at these, and some of them at least, as potential cases of trafficking? Because people don't simply go missing, you know.
Okay, what about, you spoke about 2 or 3 different scenarios as to why there's this rise in human trafficking, not only in South Africa, but all around the world. We spoke prostitution, we spoke body parts. There's also the issue around forced labor. Yeah,
labor and domestic servitude, street begging. There's a lot of purposes. Is
that true? Is that an urban legend?
No. Well,
or is that true? Because you see beggars on almost every second street corner.
But that is where we need to look at the definition. Now, that also does not mean that every beggar is a trafficking victim. By no means. What I'm saying is that that when there's a position of vulnerability and a person is given a promise, which is a person being deceived. I'm going to use one example. Back in Port Elizabeth, I investigated the case of a pastor. So this was a pastor who took care of children, and he apparently ministered to them. So he would go around in the coloured community, would pick up a lot of children, he would house them in a flat, about 30 of them in two flats, kind of the dilapidated flats. So what he would do is that during the day, in the morning, 7 o'clock, he would drop them off on all different parts of the city, and they had to go and beg until 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. He would collect the money, and he would then take them back to the flat. So in effect, that was a case of trafficking for the purposes of begging. So that could be where a person is in a debt bondage, or where a person is threatened or controlled in one or other way, forced to beg, and then the exploiter, pocketing the money. So I think each case needs to be deconstructed on its own merits.
Absolutely.
But
Talk to us a little bit about debt bondage. I know a lot of that again happens in the East. Are we seeing that happening in South Africa?
Absolutely.
Explain the concept to us.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to use one example. 2 weeks ago, I was in a brothel in Cape Town. So that always sounds funny, just with investigations.
I know you're investigating, and I know you're researching.
So there, speaking to some of the women, and this came out, interestingly, from the one waitress. It was an Afrikaans coloured lady in the mid-50s. So when she came and she served us, and there was two ladies, there were 3 Siberian ladies and 1 Congolese girl that was sitting there, and they just suddenly made fun of this girl, but they were very rude at her. She was an adult female woman. And after they left and they did their dances, and I asked this lady, just come and sit here, because I didn't enjoy the fact that they were rude with you. She started crying, and then she started explaining that she herself was under debt bondage. She gets paid 2,700 Rand a month for up to 60 hours a week, and she at that stage had a debt of 25,000 Rand to repay. So when some of the clients used services of the ladies and the clients passed out or they didn't pay, the debt didn't go to the girls, it was added onto the waitress's bill. So the waitresses would split the debt. That's just with the waitresses, but now we're talking about some of the women working in these clubs. They have to pay a levy of between 2,000 and 3,000 Rand per week to the owner of the club, and if they spend too much time with one client, or they chew chewing gum, or they smoke, or they don't change the lingerie, there's fines between 10 and 20,000 Rand that can be imposed on something like that. Then you speak about labourers, who's not performing, according to what they are instructed to do. Some of these people can't even speak the language. Labourers where, in what field? Well, that could be across the board. I mean, we recently. Labourers? You see, obviously exploitation is happening on our farms. That is without a doubt. Now, once again, before you label something as trafficking, you need to investigate it. So I'm not saying, human trafficking is happening all over our farms. No, but farm labor exploitation, exploitative practices do happen. And only by investigating a case will you be able to check whether there's... but I'll use one example. And once again, a recent Johannesburg example with a Malawi husband and his wife that came to work for foreign businessmen, and they worked in a large factory 7 days a week, and when they got the job here, this guy told her, well, I had to pay for your visa, I paid for your transportation costs, you owe me 150,000 Rand, which is disproportionate to what it actually costs, but that's typically what a debt bondage is. So the chance of you ever paying that off is minute. So the fact that you have this debt to pay off
for the rest of your life,
basically it keeps you in a subjugated state, and that's effectively what a debt bondage is. And I'm sure, just speaking to waiters and waitresses all over the country, and also people in these hidden corners of the country, debt bondage is a method, sadly, that's not only used by traffickers, but by seemingly proper businessmen.
Regular people.
Oh, yes.
What are you hoping that your research is going to show? Who are you targeting it at? And are you hoping that that's going to change the situation in South Africa?
Well, I sincerely hope that, and I think I've done quite a large study on human trafficking for sexual exploitation, but ultimately directed at policymakers, decision makers. I mean, if you have a police manager deciding whether you should allocate 1 or 3 people to human trafficking, I'm hoping that after considering the research, you will not allow one person to do that workload on his or her own. And also the issue of vicarious trauma, which is such a big issue. Vicarious trauma by the caregiver, police officials, social workers, prosecutors is a massive issue. Our people are overburdened. The criminal justice system is groaning under the workload, and you have absolutely dedicated prosecutors and investigators who are doing their level best, but they are struggling, and it has an incredibly emotional toll on them. I do witnessing in court cases at the moment. I'm currently busy with one court case where both the investigator and the prosecutor basically had I don't even call it a nervous breakdown, but had suffered immense strain because of the merits of the case. So the point is there we need to look after our people who's doing this very crucial role, because it's not sustainable. So there's multiple issues that I'm hoping to address and help create mindfulness about, which we need to consider.
And by way of this interview, we've kind of only just scratched the surface. We know that it runs really deep. It's very, very complex. But of course, we're just putting the thought out into our viewers' minds, and we're hoping that people become more alert, more responsible, try and just not judge a situation at face value, realize that life and life situations are extremely complex, and where and however we can ease the burden or help in some way, we should do our level best, because it's a really dark, murky and broken world that we're living in.
And people are complex human beings. So giving a one-dimensional framing of a situation is just stupid. I mean, we should be reflexive in terms of who we are, as sometimes in an unequal position of power, how we frame, how we engage with people, and allowing people a safe space to communicate a need or a pain or a situation which requires an investigation into. So we often have these preconceived ideas, and often sadly also stigma. It's also stigma around prostitution, which does not lend itself to seeing the person behind that, which might be an exploitative situation.
Absolutely. Okay, time for another ad break,
Sure.
and then we'll be wrapping up. Marcel van der Walt is talking to us about a whole host of issues, social injustice issues. And of course, from what he tells us, the social justice system is absolutely straining under the burden of all of these issues. And perhaps it's time we as South Africans and global citizens start waking up and doing our bit to heal this broken world. So much to talk about with Marcel van der Walt, and only about another 12 minutes or so left. Let's wrap up by talking about the articles he's written for a magazine called, I think it's Gateway News. He's written a whole host of articles. The one that jumped out at me was entitled Racism, Irreversible Shackles with a Tangible Key. So you've got a bit of a writer in you as well, and you need to get out these very strong messages across to a wide spectrum of people, black, blue, white, green, whoever and whatever they might be. What was this article all about?
Well, it was just a preliminary insight. I mean, there's much more to write about, but I mean, as a white male in South Africa, so let's rather say as an Afrikaanse wit man in South Africa. White Afrikaan, exactly.
Brought up in privilege.
Very privileged. And I think trying to deconstruct what we actually mean by white privilege, what we mean by privilege. And the fact, and very open in that article, that I still see racism all around me on a daily basis. And it's not overt racism, it's subtle racism, which is much more dangerous. And I think trying to expose it, so when I do public speaking, when I'm speaking about the issue of human trafficking or a range of other issues, I begin with explicating who I am, and I acknowledge that race and racism is interconnected with everything we do and are in South Africa. And I think it's a call to, and it's a challenge to other white people, to come out.
Are you not apologizing on behalf of the other white Afrikaners in South Africa? No.
Why do I need to apologize? Well, apologize for their... Well, you know what? I am, if it means anything...
Yes and no.
If it means anything, absolutely. I mean, I feel sorry, I feel ashamed when I hear these... when I hear what's going on, when we hear these things in the media, I wasn't exactly sure what you mean about apologizing, but apologizing for the ills of the past and the continuing ills. Absolutely. And unreservedly so. I think often people start a discussion, a reconciliatory discussion, and sadly, the dichotomous language is pervasive. Us, them, here, there.
Black,
and
white.
There's black, white, and there's always a but. And I think we need to start nipping the but in the butt, really.
What makes a young person like you so passionate about the issue of racism and decide that it has to... This nonsense has got to stop now. Accept people for who they are, human beings just like you and I. The only difference being that the color of our skins is slightly different. Yours is a lighter shade, mine is a paler shade, etc., etc., etc. What makes you so different from perhaps, and I don't want to generalize, but perhaps from other racist people?
Julie, I think it comes down to, and I think I've mentioned it before to you as well, I experienced my relationship with my God as profoundly real, and that convicts me, and it also knowing that these are the issues that makes his heart beat as well. And knowing that, I need to respond to that. And I willingly do that. I'm really literally willing to lay my life down for many of these things. And I think it needs to be exposed, because a lot of these things remain concealed, and there are people who are at the tail end of suffering these abuses, who sees it for what it is, and it invokes incredible anger and bitterness, because you have people who have this position and the ability to concede to wrongs of the past and ongoing wrongs, but they don't do that. So I think in many ways, I consider in many ways that there's a ticking time bomb. You cannot ignore these injustices,
People are
forever.
people regardless of the colors of their skin.
Exactly. Yeah.
And of course, you also alluded to the fact that you're a very God-fearing or a very spiritual being. And
we all are. And we all are.
And we all believe in the one God. You'd call him by whatever you call him, but we refer to him as Allah, but it is just the one God. There's no multiple gods, we just need to get past that as well. But be that as it may, there was a landmark case and ruling recently in South Africa. As a white Afrikaner, how do you view it? And I'm talking about the Vicky Momber case. Was it too harsh? Was it too lenient? Is it the right time for a judgment like this? And where to from here for South Africans as far as racism and racist slurs are concerned?
Absolutely. That was, I in full agreement with the judgment. I think, we condemn racism, but up until now it's been lip service, really, And I think the Vicky Momber case, notwithstanding the fact that a incarceratory sentence is what I agree with, but I think that's only a structural mechanism, and structural interventions have their limitations, and unless it is paralleled with thematic interventions where there's
for example,
being mindful about the issue of issues like privilege. What does it mean to be privileged? What does it mean continuing to use racist language. What is racist language, you know? So there's so many things that still needs to be spoken about. So I think awareness and a critical introspection and reflexivity is what is required. And I think, unfortunately, that's not forthcoming from the white community. I'm telling that to you unequivocally. It's not forthcoming. So therefore, I would argue that there needs to be interventions, whether it's the government starting it or I volunteering for the government, and I'd like to be part of the project, but there's an awareness creation. So you know what, guys, this is why this sentence was absolutely needed and crucial at this point in South Africa, sadly 25 years after democracy, but that's what's going to happen if you continue doing this. But let's talk about how you can think differently, and I think there's a paradigmatic change, there's an attitudinal change, and there's a culture change within the white Afrikaans community that needs to change. And unless that is not going to change, the structural intervention is not going to happen. That's why I'm saying you need both a structural and a thematic intervention that runs parallel to one another.
As a young white South African boere nogal, how do you see South Africa in light of what's just happened with Vicky Momberg, all the dark issues that we've unpacked here on the show this morning, racism, the issue around human trafficking and everything else that goes with it? Well, we haven't touched on it, but the issue around unemployed youth, I think the figure sits at about 9 million unemployed youth. What's the future like for them? And all of these issues are all, as you said, intertwined and creates the unhealthy situations that a lot of youth find themselves in. And then the older people saying there's no future for this country or whatever else they want to say. And they say it out of exhaustion, desolation, fatigue, and just thinking nothing's ever going to change. What is our future? How do we work together to make that change?
How do we work together? Let's start there. I think South Africans and our history has shown, especially in the black culture, but also in the white culture, we're good at telling stories. And I think we need to start listening to one another's stories, you know, and there needs to be a platform where we are, you know, if a measure of force is needed, then we need to use that force to get people together and literally talk and listen and to actually consider the humanity in the other person's story and consider that, well, that could have been me, and identifying positions of privilege and identifying positions of vulnerability and inequality. And I think only then, and realizing that our otherness is part of our makeup. I don't think we'll ever be able to escape that, but the fact that we are different can actually be a platform where we agree, well, we are different, and that could be a platform from where we move forward. But I also think we need to begin with the end in mind. So asking ourselves, in 20 years' time, or in 30 years' time, where do we want to be as South Africans? And we sketch this ideal situation, and then we ask ourselves, white, pink, black, colored, whatever, how do we get there? What are the tangible paradigmatic steps that we take to actually get there? And we collectively apply collective wisdom, we instill collective compassion, and we decide, well, these are the steps now. Together we are moving, we're doing this. And we also have, a caveat that, well, if you don't agree to this, or if you kind of go off the road, then these are the steps that we take. And we hold you mutually and collectively accountable and responsible for not buying into this project. But I think we need to do this collectively. Without that collective compassion, the bright future that we all wish for, will remain an elusive.
Undoubtedly, lots of hard work and a long road ahead of us. It's a beautiful country. It's a rich country. There's enough to go around for each and everybody. And I think if we kind of stood side by side and held hands and moved forward together, the sky is the limit. Thank you for being with us. I really appreciate all your thoughts, and good luck with all of the hard, incredibly dark work that you're doing. But I know people like you is making South Africa a safer place for us and our children. God bless. That was Marcel van der Walt talking about the ills of society as we know it. And we just hope and pray Together we can achieve much, so let's put our heads together. Let's try hard at making South Africa way, way better than it currently is. Still to come, we're going to talk land grab with Wiseman Hamilton. My next guest is Wiseman Hamilton. He comes from Eldorado Park here in Johannesburg. It is a coloured township, and he's here to talk about land expropriation, another issue which sits at the hearts of many people. And of course, the issue around land grab has created fears, perhaps unwanted fears, amongst lots of people. We're going to look at the issue of expropriation without compensation and also land grab, which I guess equates to one and the same thing. But before we do that, let's understand who exactly is Wiseman Hamilton. His political career or birth started with his involvement with the Black Consciousness movement, and it hasn't stopped since. Morning, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Lovely to have you here. A die-hard activist.
That's correct.
How did you become involved in the struggle? And I know it started with your Black Consciousness movement, and you haven't stopped ever since. Your life has been a life of activism, and you've been involved with different political parties throughout that. Currently, you are with?
I'm with the Workers' and Socialist Party, which is essentially the same party that I joined when I first went into exile, which has undergone a change in political identity, but not in program and not in orientation. In other words, it's been a political party committed to the struggle for the emancipation of the working class and the socialist transformation of society. And to the extent that it has adopted different names in the course of the political evolution of the country itself, that has been to find the most effective way in which to reach the ear of the masses, who are the real proprietors, if you like, of the ideas of socialism that we espouse as the Workers' and Socialist Party.
This should be talking to all the young people, very especially the 9 million odd unemployed youth in the country.
Yeah.
And yet they seem to be attracted by ANC and EFF. What is it that you guys are doing wrong that you're not attracting that vote?
Well, first of all, we're a very young party, and the resources at our disposal are incomparably less than what, for example, was poured into the EFF from, amongst others, big business interests. Otherwise, the EFF would certainly not have been able to put up the performance that they did. But I wouldn't argue that either the ANC or the EFF enjoys the majority support of the youth or even of the working class. If you look at the outcome of the last elections, for example, the local government elections, 12 million people didn't vote. That means that the ANC, the EFF, the ANC, to take them by themselves, represent the active electoral support of only 34% of the eligible voting population. And therefore, I think that what we have is an enormous vacuum on the left, which we believe in time, either ourselves or a mass workers' party, which happily we have noticed is back on the agenda, particularly through the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa's decision to take the idea that they first discussed at their Special National Congress in 2013 to the new federation of which the General Secretary is Zwelinzima Vavi. At the founding conference last year, SAFTU decided to set up a political and ideological commission, which has since met and which made a firm recommendation for the launch of a mass workers' party, through an Assembly for Working Class Unity.
Okay, great. We're going to watch that space.
Yeah.
But in March 1983, you landed up in Botswana. Was that when you obviously left the country because you were afraid that you might get locked up?
Actually, I left the country in 1976. 83 is the date on which I arrived in London, having been redeployed there by what was then known as the Marxist Workers' Tendency of the ANC, of which WASP is the descendant. I left in 1976 after spending 2 periods in detention in solitary confinement, both in 1975 for 9 months and a further 2 months in 1976.
I often wonder, how did you guys were under, activists obviously, political activists, were under scrutiny by the security forces all
That's
times.
correct.
How did you guys manage, and how did you in particular manage to get out undetected and try and continue the fight elsewhere in the world?
Well, look, by the time of the Soweto uprising, there was a well-established networking of activists underground with clearly identified routes and methods by which it was possible to make contact with the relevant people and to make arrangements to get out of the country. I remember one of the funny incidents on the night that we left, that we nearly forgot one of the comrades, because after our release in May of 1976, we were given 5-year banning orders, and that entailed, as banning orders do, your confinement to the township where you grew up. Now, I was in Noordgesig, where I had grown up, but one of the comrades, Chris Weymers, was confined in Eersterus township, and we nearly forgot him, so we had to drive all the way back. On our way near Zeerust, we ran out of petrol and had to go and find somebody, take the chance of just finding somebody late at night who would be generous enough to assist us to continue our journey. And we were able to cross the border the following morning, not too very far from the border post, but because of the way in which the borders of the whole continent, as a matter of fact, have been redrawn irrespective of where people are, what their relations are, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of trafficking, human trafficking, in the conventional sense of the word. People going across to see their relatives or to go shopping across the border and so on. So we're able to blend in with that and be able to get across the border without incident.
Okay, so you were out of the country for a good many years.
Yeah.
You've come back and you have a couple of fights on your hands, which we're going to talk about after the first break. But I also know that you were involved with the mines. You spent a stint with mine workers. What was that all about? And also, how did the Marikana tragedy impact on you? I mean, having worked so closely with the miners, and I see on your shirt you have Remember Marikana, obviously it's something very close to your heart.
Absolutely. Well, we didn't find ourselves in Rustenburg, in the area by accident. We were actually approached 4 years earlier by mine workers who had become disillusioned by the failure of the National Union of Mine Workers to represent them and to fight their cause. As a matter of fact, we were approached by workers who were employed then by Marion Roberts, 4,000 of whom had been dismissed after they had embarked on a protected strike, but which strike was rendered unprotected by the decision of the leadership to sign an agreement behind the backs of the members without a mandate. And when the workers insisted that the leadership have a duty to account to them and take their mandate from them, the leadership simply abandoned them, and the workers were dismissed by under what was now an unprotected strike. And it was to us they turned. They'd knocked on the doors of the SACP, they'd gone to COSATU, and the NUM at that stage was the most powerful affiliate of COSATU. and the SACP had powerful positions within COSATU itself, so they were not going to assist those workers. And as a result, with the little resources that we had, we tried our best to approach lawyers to assist on a pro bono basis to try and secure their reinstatement. We didn't succeed in the end, but we won the respect of those workers for all the efforts that we made. And that is the reason that by the time the strike wave commenced in 2012, we had a certain authority amongst the workers about how the strike could most effectively be prosecuted.
Okay, let's take an ad break. When we come back, let's just understand where the Marikana issue, if the issue has been resolved, if it hasn't, what is it going to take to resolve that? And then we'll go on to land expropriation. Okay. My guest is Wiseman Hamilton. He hails from formerly Noordgesig and then moved on to Eldorado Park, an activist all his life, talking about a whole host of political issues and the current scenario in South Africa. We've got 12 minutes more left with Wiseman Hamilton, and as you can see, he's an absolute die-hard activist fighting for the rights of the undertrodden masses right here in South Africa. Back to you, and in 2 minutes, what do you believe should have been done to have avoided the Marikana massacre, and do you believe that the demands of the workers was unrealistic?
Actually, an investigation was conducted into the profits of Lonmin, amongst others, but the platinum industry as a whole, by an organization called the Alternative Information Development Center. And their calculations were that not only could they meet, could the mining industry, the platinum mining industry meet the demands of the workers, but they would still be making billions in profits. Remember that the platinum industry in South Africa controls 80% of platinum production worldwide, so they are therefore price setters rather than price takers. And they were making billions, and at the same time, by the way, engaged in illicit capital flows out of the country by registering their head offices, not in South Africa, so that the profits can be smuggled out. So the argument that they couldn't afford it is a complete nonsense. It could have been afforded. But even we were to leave that artificially as just a matter of labor relations for the unions and management to sort out. We had people like Ramaphosa sitting on the board of Lonmin. Why didn't he hold Lonmin to account in relation to the undertakings to provide housing, to provide sanitation? People were living like dogs in the area and became indebted, by the way, not only to Mashonisas, but also to the bank that was created in collaboration between the NUM and the Chamber of Mines. So the NUM leadership developed a vested interest in lower wages, because otherwise there would be no need for the workers to come and borrow money, because the mine workers were their primary clientele. It was a noxious and most despicable collaboration between the union leadership, ultimately the government, the mining bosses themselves. And now Ramaphosa is the president. This is the man that created the climate, by the way, for the manner in which the police ultimately acted. And nobody has been held to account.
What needs to be done now for closure on that matter in Marikana? What needs to happen?
Well, first of all, I think that the mining companies must be held first of all, apart from the reparations and all of that, even in terms of the mining charter and their obligations flowing from that, why is that not enforced? They must provide houses, they must provide schools, they must provide hospitals, they must provide proper recreation for the children of the workers. They must provide decent housing to enable the mine workers to bring their families with them, to come and live with them. All of that is perfectly reasonable, by the way. And it is not as if it is foreign to the country's history. If you take companies like Sasol or the railways, these were things that were done under apartheid, by the way.
Why has it not been done yet?
Because
and whom do you hold to account?
The government, and the capitalist class behind them, on behalf of whom the ANC government is running the country.
Well, let's hope and pray that elections 2019, people will start speaking by voting for whom they believe would be able to speak up for them, like perhaps your party.
Yes.
We're going to move on now, and the question is, will expropriation of land without compensation, because that's the big debate in the country at the moment, eradicate poverty, inequality and unemployment? By the way, Cyril Ramaphosa says that this will not happen. Land will not be expropriated without compensation, but we've already seen land grabs happening all around the country. Your view?
Well, first of all, I think the agreement between the ANC and the EFF on expropriation of land without compensation is one of the biggest acts of modern political deception. First of all, it is not true, by the way, that the clause 25, the so-called property clause, prohibits the government from undertaking land expropriation without compensation.
Is this rural or urban land?
It doesn't specify. It's irrespective of whether it's rural or urban. It is true that there are pieces of legislation that specify that if any expropriation does take place, it has to be based on market value, it has to be based on willing seller, willing basis, but it's not located in the Constitution, and that's an important point. Because the argument that the EFF has been advancing, for example, is that they will offer their 6% to the ANC 62 to amend the Constitution, something that is not warranted. I'm not saying that this is a constitution that we as the Workers' and Socialist Party have any illusions in, by the way. It's a capitalist constitution. And the subsidiary legislation that expresses the spirit of the Constitution by the letter of their content ensures the preservation of the economic dictatorship of the capitalist class, which lies at the basis of the negotiated settlement signed at CODESA. But I'm saying that this is a deception, because if you look, I'm the secretary, by the way, of the Transport Communal Property Association. We won our land back through a court process in 1999 in Limpopo.
In Limpopo, okay.
Yeah. In Limpopo, we won our land back in 1999. We can't use the land as collateral to go to the bank to develop the land. The court made it a condition for us getting the land that we we come up with a business plan to develop the land. We developed it. It took us years. One promise after the other was made and broken by various administrations, and we got caught up in the factional civil war within the ANC, which has still not played itself out. But to cut a long story short, our business plan was valued at 93 million. They were prepared to give us only 17. That is an undertaking that they gave to us about 3 months ago. What have they paid into the account? 3 million. It's impossible.
So it's a typical case of expropriation without compensation.
Well, in this particular instance, yes, it was. It was entirely possible. It was taken from the Dutch Reformed Church. Whether they were compensated or not, I think, is irrelevant in this situation, because it is not the obligation to provide compensation that stands in the way of land reform, land restitution in the country at all, by the way. 80% of land restitution has failed because of corruption, because of incompetence, and because of collusion between the ANC government and so-called traditional leaders, a problem that they've aggravated. The day after Ramaphosa announced his support for expropriation of land, expropriation without compensation, he addressed the House of Traditional Leaders and there endorsed the illegal power that has been appropriated, by the way, by traditional leaders to sign agreements with mining companies without consulting the people who have customary land rights in the areas that they are presiding over.
So you're painting a picture of doom and gloom. Let's just understand, and I suppose that's the reality. Let's understand there's going to be a lot of politicking going forward into 2019. Everyone wants your vote, so they're going to promise you the world. For an ordinary person, lay person like myself and our other viewers watching this morning, what does this all mean? And let's assume someone's got a couple of properties all around the country, a home they live in Johannesburg, and they've got a couple of holiday properties and a few business properties. Yeah. What's the risk to them?
I think that
Can people come and just expropriate, even if you have a piece of, farmland that's just lying there, it's not being worked on or anything, but, in your mind, you're thinking, well, it's a future investment for my children or my grandchildren.
Yeah.
What are the risks when we look at expropriation without compensation or land grab? Is this going to be a reality?
I don't think that we should prepare ourselves for the possibility that there's going to be widespread incidents of that kind. They will occur. There's no question about that. There is enormous, and if you look at the incidents of land grabbing, they're overwhelmingly in the urban areas. There's 1 or 2 cases where people have gone to the farms, actually. The problem of land in the country is far less a rural area than a rural problem than it is an urban problem. People don't have anywhere to live. There's been an exodus, an in-migration into the cities as a result of the impact of the policies which the ANC government has pursued, that has driven farm owners out of business. The total debt. So
they migrate to the cities for work,
and they can't find anywhere to live.
So any available piece of land, they're going to go and squat on and make their home there.
And it's entirely possible for local government. I mean, Mashaba has indicated that there's land.
It's time to wrap up. One short, sharp answer. What does the future look like as far as land grab is concerned? Is it going to be a reality?
I think that there will be incidences, but I don't think that it will become a widespread phenomenon. I think that there is sufficient pressure within society for this matter to be undertaken in a matter that is in the best interest of the majority, to ensure that that kind of the ideas promoted by the EFF don't become the predominant narrative so far as the question of land grabbing is concerned. What we argue is that the problem is the ownership of the productive capacity of the land by a tiny minorities of companies that control the entire food chain.
Oh, absolutely.
That's who should be expropriated.
Absolutely.
With compensation only on the basis of proven need.
And that's where we have to leave it, unfortunately, at the crucial hour. There you have it, land grab, land expropriation without compensation. Lots of unanswered questions, and of course, lots of questions that I haven't had the opportunity to put to Wiseman, but perhaps another time. In the meanwhile, watch the space. That's all I can say. Thank you for watching. Till the next time, as always, a big thank you to the production team. And as always, it is Assalamu Alaikum and Khudafiz from me, Julie Alli.